just going to open up my first Phyrexia, and all will be one booster pack.
Wait. Wait, what? What? No. Oh, what is wrong with you? Oh my God! I'm never gonna be able to eat ice cream again. Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh, that is disgusting! Oh my God!
But there's more looking pretty thick.
Do you need to do any prep? Are you ready to go?
I think so.
Great, we're just going to go right into it then. Ready to walk into the basement. World record time from in the door to recording a podcast.
Well, maybe I should just, breathe for a second.
Nah, I think this is good. Let's use this energy.
It's cold outside. It's so cold.
It is very cold.
It's too cold.
But we're inside, recording this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Hello and welcome. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Would definitely just taste a little bit of the Phyrexian oil.
It would be really hard not to.
You would. I think this is one of the things that indicates that you are a true good cook, is that you will taste a little bit of anything. Doesn't matter what it is, you will taste it.
I mean, if it's food, I feel like that's a little bit of a broad statement to make. But
I mean, I've seen you, nibble on various dog treats, which I guess is food adjacent.
That is not true. That's not true.
I
don't think that's true.
I've seen it.
I would no, that never happened.
You'll eat anything, though. Any ingredient, just a little dab of it.
Yes. I mean, you got to know what you're cooking with. Would you paint a painting without looking at the colors? Think about it that way.
Yeah. I guess I wouldn't. It's true.
Yep.
I just don't want to eat, a little bit of just straight up fermented bean paste, for example.
Yeah, I would say the one thing that I didn't taste at first was a certain fermented mustard tuber. That's really, really good in stir-fried green beans, stuff like that. But it had an intense odor the first time you smell it. But turns out it's delicious.
I also wouldn't like just a little dab of fish sauce. I know what it's going to add to the dish. I don't want to taste the fish sauce in isolation.
Absolutely, that's important.
Yeah, well, one of the many things I learned about cooking from you is to taste everything, and also taste the thing you're cooking at every step, even if you know it's going to be bad, because it's not done yet. You still got to taste it anyway.
I feel like there's also just a little bit of a compulsion. You got some diced vegetables.
Yeah, I don't have that
You
compulsion.
taste a little bit.
Well, I'll eat a carrot if I'm chopping it up or something. How many times have you eaten a raw onion just because you had some raw onion sitting around?
Ooh, occasionally.
Yeah. How about raw garlic? You ever mess up some raw garlic?
I mean, yeah, you got to try it once.
See? Case in point.
Some people love raw garlic. It's a thing.
You would definitely eat the Phyrexian oil. No question.
Fine. Yep.
I mean, it's not an insult. I'm just saying it's a thing about you. If you lived in this world, you'd be completed because you'd be like, maybe this is good for frying stuff.
I'd be like Luca, you can't get me, but I can meld with your beast for sure, no problem. I can meld with anything.
You'd be like, what's the flashpoint of Phyrexian oil? Is it good for deep frying? Is it more of a sautéing oil? Maybe it's just a finishing oil for a dressing. You don't know.
So
you gotta taste it.
Is the oil nanites? Is it little nanorobots?
Oh, you're asking the wrong guy. Okay. I have absolutely no clue.
The Phyrexians are so close to the Borg in a lot of ways that I feel like it's got to be.
Yeah.
Or magical nanites.
Do the Borg have little tiny robots also?
Yeah, Borgs have little tiny robots, right?
I don't know. Is that how they take over people's bodies and turn them into Locutus of Borg?
Yeah, pretty confident.
Okay. We'll have to ask our friend... Crap. What's the name of that one Borg they befriend? It's not like...
The one...
Hank?
Seven
Hal.
of Nine? Or Hugh?
Hugh! Thank you.
Hugh.
You got it. I knew it was an
Yeah.
H name. Yeah, Hugh. They befriend Hugh. We have to ask Hugh if he's full of little robots or not. He'll tell us. Anthony, this is the first of our 3 Phyrexia All-Will-Be-One preview episodes. Review, set episodes. We're talking about Phyrexia All-Will-Be-One as it pertains to Cube. And in this first of 3 episodes, we're going to be talking everything about the mechanics. Just, absent the context of any specific Cube environment, we are just talking about the cards printed in this set, the mechanics they have, and how those mechanics might impact existing cubes or create the space for brand new cubes to exist, and talking about it very abstractly. Then next week on the show, we're going to be talking about the cards that you and I are adding to our very personal cubes. So that episode is just in the context of our own cube environments. We just pretend all other cubes don't exist. And then finally, on the third of 3 episodes, which sometimes is a couple weeks later, we'll be reviewing the responses from our community survey, which is a good reminder for you, listener, to go fill out our survey for Phyrexia All-Will-Be-One and also Phyrexia All-Will-Be-One Commander, which is on our website. It's at luckypaper.co/survey/1, or you can just go to the homepage or any page and check out the banner at the top and click on that link.
And maybe we should explain the survey a little bit, just because listenership is
been
growing. So basically, for every set, we do a survey of all of the new cards that are in every new set, and we ask people to pick out the cards that they're interested in trying in their own cube environments, and then rate them on a scale of 1 to 3 based on how likely they think that card is going to be, a staple, an all-star in their cube that's going to be there forever, or on the low end of the spectrum, it's something that's kind of speculative. You're giving it a try, but you kind of expect it's not going to quite make it. And importantly, this survey is not just about what are the most powerful cards or the best cards. They are about the cards that you as a cube designer think are just the best fit for your environment. So judge them based on that. We have all kinds of other tools that apply to all other formats about what the most powerful cards are. This is really an opportunity for cube designers to talk about the cards that just are the best game pieces for whatever reason it is that makes sense to them, whether it's about gameplay, they just love the illustration so they think they can never cut it, or any other reason.
And if you literally only care about power level when it comes to your cube, then yes, fill it out.
Fine.
Fill it out based on power level. And also, you're a sicko. You should know this. That's some sick perverted behavior. You should care about other things.
Pretty normal behavior.
No, I mean, I think even players that have a largely power-driven cube still have things they care about otherwise that will keep them from playing cards.
Sure.
I think this set features a thing that will keep people from playing cards even if they're very powerful that we will talk about in this episode.
Point.
Should we just dive right into these mechanics then, Anthony?
Let's do it.
All right, as always, I'm going to take the mechanics in order that they are on Wizards of the Coast's official All-Be-One Mechanics article. And then, Anthony, you oftentimes have a couple other trends you've identified, a couple other cycles or things that are not named mechanics that are worth talking about. We'll talk about it at the end. But first is Toxic. In many ways, I think the flagship mechanic of the set. Toxic is a keyword ability found on creatures, and anytime a creature with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets a number of poison counters equal to the toxic value of that creature. So this is a variation on Infect, kind of. Infect basically replaced any combat damage dealt to players with instead poison counters. This instead says if you deal combat damage to a player, you also get whatever that fixed number of poison counters is equal to that toxic value. So Toxic always appears on a card as Toxic 1, Toxic 2, etc., etc.
Yeah, it's interesting how much this entire set, in terms of the mechanics, are not even like callbacks. They are just sort of like reworking of the previous mechanics from Mirrodin, right?
Look, we did it better.
We did it better, which is kind of an interesting take on set design, where they're just reusing a lot of old game design history, but trying to sort of fix it and improve it. And we've seen poison counters come up in a few different iterations. There were, I think, originally just maybe 1 or 2 poison cards in. I'm forgetting my history a little bit.
Oh, way back in the
Sight.
day, there was some. No, I think way earlier than Future Sight, there was even weird poison cards, like Mirage or something. I think had like a random poison snake.
And then we saw that combined with Wither to turn to create creatures that both dealt damage to creatures in terms of -1/-1 counters and poison counters to players, which is kind of an interesting mechanic in Infect. And then we're seeing poison counters reworked a third time, where poison still works the same way, but the way it interacts with the creatures is different. And what they've just done is disconnected it from the actual power of the creature, which just opens up a lot more design space, because they can make big creatures that will slowly kill you with Infect, with poison, or make a small creature that potentially, if you get through, have a huge toxic number. So it just gives them a lot more knobs to turn.
I don't know if my Scryfall search is not indicative here, but I searched for O Poison, sorted by release date ascending, and according to this, the very first card with the word poison on it was Leeches from Homelands, which removes poison counters.
The poison.
So surely that's not actually correct. But yeah, there's a Crypt Cobra and Sabertooth Cobra, both in Mirage here, that have poison counters, as well as some stuff in Visions. So it was sprinkled into some sets kind of always throughout time, and the first time it was a real mechanic was in the Mirrodin block.
And it's hard to talk about Toxic here without also talking about this related mechanic of Corrupted, which, these two really go together. Corrupted is just a keyword ability. It's sort of like an input mechanic, which says this
card... It's an ability word, not a keyword ability.
Ability word. Great. Thank you for fixing these terms. They're really important. Where if your opponent has at least 3 poison counters, something else happens. You get some static ability, or you'll end up getting a trigger, or the...
it's just spell. A Boolean. It turns something on the same way that Threshold or Delirium turns something on. The condition here is just that your opponent has 3 or more poison counters.
Right. So these two mechanics really obviously fit together, because you need to give your opponents poison counters in order to get these corrupted abilities, which I think is interesting just that it kind of makes this whole set a little bit insular, that a lot of these cards are not necessarily going to work in any cube you put them in because you're not going to be able to use these corrupted cards or at least get their full effect. You're going to have just extra text on them unless you also have some critical mass of cards that either have the toxic mechanic or one of these other poison mechanics in order to turn them on, which I think is fine for limited. Obviously, it makes sense in the standard environment, but what do you think as a cube designer? How are you going to approach these mechanics?
Well, my first thought here is I do think, as far as cube design goes, these mechanics are big improvements over the original Mirrodin block poison mechanic, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, you're avoiding saying the word, but we should talk about the word parasitic.
I was wondering if we could get through this whole episode.
No, I think we have to address it.
Word.
We have to address the elephant in the room. I think a lot of people are calling these mechanics parasitic, and this is the word that we hear bandied around if a mechanic is narrow, if a card seems like it, only fits in a very specific environment, or a mechanic that only works with itself. People will often call it parasitic, and I don't care to use this word because there are so many different ideas of what it means. To me, neither of these mechanics are remotely parasitic. They both will work just fine in any other environment. I think original poison, that is the definition to me of parasitic because infect, the keyword ability, or ability word, now I don't know which one it was, original infect would replace combat damage with poison counters, meaning that if you had a deck with some regular creatures in it and then you put a random creature or two with infect in there, they would actively not contribute to your main game plan and instead detract from it and pursue this secondary game plan. So quite literally, those cards do not make sense unless you are playing only those kinds of creatures, right? And that is like the most actual parasitic mechanic that we have in Magic's history. People love to throw this word around, though, in reference to just anything narrow. They're like, oh, Grizzlebrand is parasitic. It's like, no, that's just a card that only Reanimator decks want. It's not parasitic. I think we should at least address that. And to me, you could just drop any one of these cards here into your cube and it'll be fine. I think Corrupted is the bigger one that you would argue maybe doesn't make sense, except in a place where you're putting poison counters on people, and that's probably true. Though if a card has Corrupted, but you really just like the front half of the card, the ability the card has before the Corrupted is triggered, this card will still function just fine in your cube if you just ignore that Corrupted text.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have a very strong preference of avoiding cards that have extra text.
Me
that doesn't
too.
Matter.
Trust me, I'm not doing it either. But
and I think that you alluded to everybody has a little bit of a sense of aesthetics, and there are reasons people will not play cards even if they are trying to play the most powerful cards. And I think this is a big one. If there's if half the text on the card just doesn't apply to your cube, that's going to confuse people. That's going to just not make the card it's not doing as best it can with the amount of complexity it's adding.
We've talked about this in the past with like Morph and Foretell, which are two mechanics that people will often not play except in a high density because they're like, oh, well, the secret information is not secret if there's only a couple cards with Morph or Foretell or whatever. That actually isn't a limitation on making that card playable, though, right? That's a tiny little edge. It's not most of the value of the mechanic. And so if players are ignoring cards for that reason, I expect a lot of players to ignore cards with Toxic or Corrupted because they're not designing an environment around that specific effect.
Yeah, and I'm definitely in this camp as well. I don't expect to be putting any Toxic or Corrupted cards in any of the cubes that I have currently, which honestly isn't such a bad thing. I can add to my Scryfall search for the set just a negation of Toxic and Corrupted. You can actually search for them as keywords to make sure you're picking up all the right cards, and it just cuts down the number of cards that I actually was looking at for consideration for my cubes.
So you literally didn't even think about them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I looked at a couple and I was like, yeah, this isn't for me.
I think we might see some cube designers playing one or two big toxic threats that can just, because again, they're also dealing regular combat damage. Mm-hmm. If you have a crazy creature with toxic, of which there are like at least two in this set in green, they're really, really push creatures with toxic, then they could both tack on regular combat damage if your deck is just killing people with combat damage, but also separately present this alternate win condition where even if they have life gain or, whatever, you can still get them dead with this one creature with this additional ability. And in that sense, I think the mechanics are designed much better to interact with other Magic cards in other sets. And so for Cube, if you care about this kind of effect at all, this is way better than the options we've had previously, I think, in terms of just making cards that are flexible and fit in lots of different environments.
For sure. I mean, some of the cards are also entirely self-contained. Like if we look at Skrelv's Hive, it makes things that are toxic and can give your opponents poison counters, and then it has Corrupted and gives you a better effect if you've given your opponent 3. So in that sense, we've seen plenty of mechanics throughout Magic's history that, put a story counter or a verse counter or whatever kind of
some
counter.
Random counter that has like only one use.
Totally.
Much.
So some of these cards, yeah, they are just totally self-contained, so it's entirely not parasitic in that sense.
Yeah. I'm excited to play with this mechanic in Limited. I know you went to pre-release last night. I'm going to pre-release tonight. And from what I've heard from people, the games very much revolve around poison counters, and a lot of kills come from people getting poisoned to death instead of losing all of their life. And I think it's a really interesting, flavorful thing for Phyrexia. And I also know that there's no way in this set to remove poison counters, so it's like it's just this ever-encroaching thing that there's no way to roll back from once
there might be one rare, but yeah, I mean, you're not going to see that.
There's
Nothing.
According to Judge Rob in the Good Luck High Five episode, there is nothing that removes poison counters in this set.
What does this new Malira, the Living Cure, do? Oh yeah, sure doesn't.
Anyway, so it's the kind of thing where you might stabilize, but if you're just at 9 poison counters or whatever, you're just a proliferate away from being dead.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and I love when the flavor is actually reinforced by the mechanics in a set, and you're totally right. Like, getting that first poison counter is spooky. Like, it makes the whole sort of environment feel scary.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I mean, getting the 9th poison counter is extremely spooky. I do want to touch on something else, though, because even though I'm not necessarily interested in looking at Toxic for any of the cubes that I have currently, because it is a somewhat limited number of cards, I do think that there has been a huge change in the way that Magic as a whole has been designed. And we talked about this a little while ago. Mark Rosewater did an episode of Drive to Work about sort of designing for, I mean, he called it designing for Eternal World. It's about designing
Commander
for
World.
Commander, for sure. And
welcome to Commander World.
One of the things that he mentioned was a challenge of designing for Commander being one of the most popular formats.
It's very funny to pretend that Mark Rosewater was talking about Vintage or Legacy when he was talking about designing. He's like, well, there are so many Vintage players.
In formats, you have this one
everything.
card you're really building around. But one of the things that he mentioned, which I hadn't considered previously, was when they're designing sets, often there'll be, a dozen cards that have the headline set mechanic, which makes sense for Constructed, where you're playing, only a dozen or so actual cards, unique cards in your deck, so you can build a deck around the mechanic with just a couple cards. That doesn't apply to singleton formats, Commander, where you need, 30 or 40 unique cards with the mechanic to feel like it is actually built around that theme. And so what we've seen is there are a ton of cards in the set that care about Toxic and Corrupted. 32 Toxic cards, 18 cards that care about Corrupted. And in addition to that, we also have a bunch of Commander decks that have been printed alongside. And something that I hadn't considered was those are a very deliberate design decision in order to say, well, we're making this mechanic that we need to print enough cards for it to actually make sense for Commander players. Where are we going to put all these extra cards? So it's not just that Commander's popular, so they've started making more products for Commander. They're really trying to solve that specific problem of how do we print enough cards to make these set mechanics actually meaningful in this very popular format, which, say what you will about Commander, I think that's actually also a huge boon to cube designers, because if you are interested in some of these more narrow mechanics that you might just dismiss, as I'm doing a little bit, I apologize.
You did filter them out of your Scryfall search completely.
But you can also look at them more carefully and just actually see that there might be enough just in this one set and the sort of accompanying products that they've specifically designed just to make sure that there is a high enough volume of these more narrow mechanics. You might find that just like that's a cool theme for some color pair to have in your cube. So I would definitely encourage people to not do what I said I did and actually consider, is there enough volume for one of these mechanics to just be a thing in a cube?
Yeah, I think that is the biggest game design reason why they make the Commander decks.
Yeah.
Is because of this exact problem. And the idea that if they print some cool cards with new mechanic X, but again, there's only a dozen or 2 dozen in the entire set across 5 colors, they're going to get a lot of people that are like, I love this mechanic, but I can't make a Commander deck around it.
Absolutely.
Bang, 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 bang. I'm posting on your Tumblr. Bang, bang, bang. Which
that is how Mark Rosewater's Tumblr feels.
It feels pretty rough sometimes. And then the biggest regular reason, of course, is making money. But the biggest game design reason, I think, is that they are trying to solve this problem of giving you enough density of these cards to actually make a singleton experience out of it, which is what most cube designers are also doing.
Right.
So I agree. I agree. I have seen a lot of people in the cube world that just out of hand completely ignore any supplemental product, and respect. I totally respect that decision. There's a lot of Magic cards. We all got to find ways to make the noise enough to manage, and if you want to just completely ignore them, that's fine. I do think that you're right, though, that the overall attitude of cube designers towards these products should be positive. It's like, great, I now actually have enough of this mechanic that if I want to design, like you said, a color pair around it, or a whole cube that is based on counters, you have all of these poison counters, you can combine that with all of the other counters you can possibly proliferate. You have so many more proliferate cards now than you had previously that you can really make a whole cube or a whole chunk of a cube dedicated to this kind of mechanic because of these Commander products.
Absolutely, yeah.
So to put a pin in it, I don't think I'm playing any toxic cards either. I don't think I'm playing any corrupted cards either. But I think overall for the cube world, this is a big improvement in how this kind of mechanic is approached. And I think this is largely an impact of Commander. I think if this was back in the age of Mirrodin, we would have gotten toxic and corrupted in lower densities, and they would have been perhaps a little more insular than they ended up being. But they are, like you said, thinking about designing for an eternal world, which
designing for a singleton world, I think, almost more importantly.
That is true, which I think does overall help cube designers, even if there's many of us out there that are salty about Commander.
Not us. No, we love Commander.
I thought I was saying the royal us.
Great.
I have Commander decks. I play.
Everybody's got them.
Once every 2 months. It's great. Our next mechanic is a very different one. It's For Mirrodin. For Mirrodin is an ability on equipment, and it basically says that the equipment enters the battlefield, then you create a 2/2 red rebel creature token and attach this equipment to it. We've talked about this mechanic a bunch on the show. We've had a similar mechanic like this in the past. We've talked about all of the barbed spikes of the world and the ancestral blades and the way that it allows you to have a more dedicated equipment theme while not running into that AB problem of you draw all your equipment or you draw all your creatures and your cards don't function together. And we're just seeing this again, which, I mean, the mechanic works, so I'm not surprised to see it again, but it's actually, I am a little surprised. I'm gonna revise that. Seeing so much of these kinds of effects on equipment, it almost seems like this is the default way equipment is going to work moving forward, almost.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen, so obviously this is a rework of Living Weapon, the original sort of living equipment mechanic, which again, it's cool. They're just sort of like revisiting all these mechanics, just trying to do these new upgraded versions.
Living Weapon was funny because like the fact that it was a 0/0 meant that the token meant nothing if the equipment went away.
Yeah.
So you did still get the first creature, essentially, because that equipment did enter the battlefield and become a creature immediately, but it was a lot less flexible beyond that.
Yeah, and then like you mentioned, we've seen a couple sort of individual cards like Barbed Spike. There was, the Wolf one from, I think, M19 and a couple
all the
others.
reconfigure cards, I think, are in this space, too.
Sure. And then we've also seen, as a sort of like adjacent equipment mechanic, the auto-equipping when you first cast an equipment, which again is sort of mitigating a little bit of that AB problem, giving the equipment just a different set of knobs to turn on the actual power level and how it functions in your deck. It's not just a huge cost to get to that initial step of having it equipped onto something.
I have half wondered if they were to design equipment today, if that would be part of the base card type.
Might just be,
that'd be how equipment would work. You play it, you attach it to something, and then if you want to reattach it, you have to use the equip ability.
I could see that.
And they would call it re-equip.
But yeah, I agree that just this is a bunch more cards that are playing in a similar space we've seen before, so I don't think this is as much a new mechanic as just a bunch of new cards that people that are already building around these equipment themes are going to enjoy in their cubes. In addition to the actual For Mirrodin cards, there are also just a bunch of cards that care about equipment, including just having affinity for equipment, which is interesting to see pop back up. So yeah, I think that
a little shout out to original Mirrodin again, though
Absolutely.
They've learned they shouldn't maybe make that a flagship mechanic because it's broken.
Certainly can be. So yeah, I think that this is a great little twist on a familiar mechanic that is going to be great for a lot of cube designers.
Yeah, I think I said this during our Neon Dynasty set review, but I think we have so many cards now that like equipment sub-themes could be a whole thing that cubes pursue. And I think it's the kind of thing where you get them like slowly over time. So if you had a cube 5 years ago, you'd be like, well, equipment sub-themes they're not going to work. There's not enough cards, there's not enough payoffs, and there's too much of an AB sort of thing going on. And then with each new set, you got a couple more, but you didn't get enough with one set to like go for it. But now if you look back in hindsight and combine this with all the other sort of one-off cards we've gotten, we got those cards from Call Time, that cycle that you could pay an extra amount a kicker to make them come in with a token. Like you could basically have a cube deck now or a cube mechanic where a whole archetype is just all of your threats are also equipment, and then you get all these cool equipment payoffs. So again, I think a lot of unexplored cube design space here potentially that someone could tap into.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been asking you to put an equipment sub-theme in the Turbo Cube just because I really want to play that
Valduk?
That Valduk guy. Yeah, that guy that makes a 3/1 with haste that exiles at the end of combat every turn for each equipment attached to it. I think in the Turbo Cube, you could definitely like one-shot people on turn 1 with that, and it would be pretty sick.
I'm into that. Something that is also a little bit of a difference in equipment is we are seeing more and more colored equipment that has colored mana in its mana cost or in the equip cost, which definitely makes it a little bit more difficult to do that really, really powerful burst of speed, specifically in the Turbo Cube, which we don't need to talk about that. But
at least not until next episode.
I think it does make a lot of these cards more flavorful and not just be like auto-includes in every deck, which, again, I think is a cool knob for cube designers. You know, we have so many equipment now. If you want things to feel like they are associated with a particular color pair, you have that option.
More broadly, what do you think about the idea of there being so many color artifacts these days? Do you think that detracts from the uniqueness of the card type now that it seems like, again, color artifacts is almost more common than colorless artifacts in some ways? Like, we get so many of them.
Great question. I feel like for subtypes of artifacts that have a really specific mechanical thing, like equipment, there it makes a lot of sense because the fact that it is an artifact is meaningful because it does a thing that other cards can't do. But in general, I do feel a little bit like it's not doing the same thing that artifacts were doing originally, which is this sort of like different flavor of this more mechanically flexible cards that anybody can include, but it's maybe a worse rate. I think it's just a different thing from what artifacts were in early Magic.
For better or worse.
I miss those brown frames, for sure.
The brown frames are so good, but we're never getting those back. Except we do.
We do.
Except we do get them now. We get everything now. The next mechanic is oil counters. And Anthony, I'm just going to have to ask you, is this any different from charge counters? Can you explain how this is any different from charge counters?
The name is a little bit different.
The name is different. Oil counters are just a type of counter that cards can have, and cards can interact with oil counters on themselves or on other cards. So it's like a new kind of resource you can manage between all your cards, but is it identical to charge counters, just named differently?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's just a totally miscellaneous counter. It has no abilities baked into itself, except it works like counters do, and as you mentioned, other cards can care about it in some way, whether that's, scaling an effect based on the number of oil counters you have on all of your permanents, or just an individual permanent caring about how many oil counters it has on it, or as a resource that you can spend by removing oil counters.
It's interesting because in the sort of designing for an eternal world space, there's definitely an argument to be made for, like, why aren't these just charge counters? There's probably people out there that have charge counter EDH decks that would love to have a brand new injection of charge counter cards, and that would be very cool. But the counter argument there, of course, is that if they're going to design new charge counter cards and they have to design for an eternal world, they have to make sure they don't make any broken cards that have interactions with existing charge counter cards from 16 years ago that are going to mess things up in certain formats. So I feel like they probably had a lengthy conversation about that. Obviously, the flavor here of making them oil counters is a big deal. It's like the inverse of the charge counters, which were resisting the Phyrexians. Now it's the thing that is helping them. But overall, I think I have an interesting decision to have a functionally, I think, identical counter. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's some mechanical thing I'm missing here, but I think they're functionally identical, except the names are different, so they don't interact with each other.
I mean, again, there are so many cards that just use miscellaneous counters that have no mechanical meaning, but just that individual card cares about it just to track some state.
Yes.
So I don't think that's really a new thing. I think that the biggest driver was probably just the flavor. Which,
the
again,
flavor of the Phyrexian oil.
We want to know what that Phyrexian oil tastes like.
Then we have some returning mechanics. Proliferate is back. This is a keyword that features on spells and permanents, and when you proliferate, you choose any number of permanents and/or players and put an additional counter for each counter type on them onto that creature and/or player. That sounded complicated. Basically, when you cast a spell that has Proliferate or activate an ability with Proliferate, you get to choose any number of things and then just uptick the counters on them. An important little rules thing here, which I actually didn't know until listening to the Judge Rob episode with Good Luck High Five, is if you choose a permanent to proliferate, you have to proliferate all the counters on it. You don't get to choose some subset of the counters on that permanent and/or player. So
yeah, this was actually a rules change. I think they changed this around War of the Spark. I'm guessing for Arena, they just didn't want you to actually click on individual counters.
Oh yeah, that'd be
just click on
pretty
the permanents.
annoying.
So yeah, there are some narrow cases there, but for the most part, you just choose whatever counters you want to uptick and you go for it.
I feel like this is a mechanic you have historically enjoyed in the regular cube because you do like to include these cards that have these small upsides that you can work to make a lot better. Like you have, for example, Volt Charge in the regular cube, which is a burn spell with Proliferate, which on its front end is perfectly fine as a burn spell, but then if you happen to have a deck that has +1/+1 counters, or I guess you have a couple of the downtick only planeswalkers in there from War of the Spark, you could get a little more value off that Proliferate. Are you excited to see the return of Proliferate?
I am. I mean, I love Proliferate because it is just unlike the corrupted and toxic abilities, which are somewhat insular, it's an extremely backwards compatible mechanic that interacts with all kinds of things. It obviously +1/+1 counters is going to be the biggest thing it interacts with in a lot of contexts, but if you have -1/-1 counters or loyalty counters on your planeswalkers or all kinds of other
charge
things that are
counters,
tracking,
experience counters.
please list all of the counters. Go.
Oh boy, it's a lot of counters.
Story counters. We mentioned verse counters. We got. That's it. That's all I can think of.
What's the chapter counters? Is that the ones on
chapter
sagas?
counters. Those are good.
Are they called chapter counters?
I think so.
It's called chapters. Who knows what they're called? You can proliferate your sagas though.
You can, and you actually, I think, get the ability when you do so.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I just think that I love Proliferate 4 being such an open-ended mechanic that will touch all kinds of other things and just lead to a lot of novel board states. So I think I'm also not alone here. There are a lot of cubes, including Carmen Handy's main cube that was featured on Magic Online, that just really lean into Proliferate and trying to do fun, wacky stuff with it.
And even if you don't, I think this is a really cool mechanic for the 1 or 2 of card inclusion in the spirit of how you often play cards in the regular cube, where the base rate of the card is good, you're happy to play it even if you never get to proliferate anything, but it does slightly change your pick orders, slightly change your sequencing to try and motivate you to actually get a little bit of extra value off of it.
And we should say there are a ton of Proliferate cards in the set. There are 33 plus a couple more in the Commander set, so if Proliferate has been something you're curious about, but maybe at whatever other restrictions you have going on, it didn't feel like something that you could really make meaningful in your cube, there's a good chance that is changed now.
That's it for the name mechanics, Anthony. Overall, like you said, this feels to me like a fixed Mirrodin.
It really does. Like, we have Living Weapon coming back, we have Toxic or Poison coming back. It's all here.
Yeah, they didn't bring back Affinity in full force, but they did a little nod to it. A
little splash.
They just did a new flavor of charge counters, which I think charge counters, I did not play during Mirrodin, but from what I've heard on many episodes of Drive to Work and maybe the Receivables, I think charge counters was a pretty well-received mechanic at the time. Kind of fun to have this extra. It's kind of like an inherently build-around style mechanic where each of the cards, like you said, almost always does function in isolation. There are very few charge counter cards, or I think oil counter cards, that only work with other cards that have those card types. They oftentimes will fuel themselves or whatever, but the fact that you can then basically turn any 2 cards into a little combo because they have this shared bridge, this mechanic connecting them, is kind of cool. It's basically a way to allow them to connect cards that are otherwise not inherently mechanically connected in the game, right? Creatures are mechanically connected because they get to attack and block. They get to interact with each other naturally. This lets them connect some random artifact to some random instant and just say these things now care about each other.
Yeah, I think that the oil counters are particularly interesting because there are kind of 2 variations. There are some that really are a little bit more insular because they care about the number of oil counters across all your permanents, or they care about, removing oil counters from your other permanents to pay as a cost, and you really do need a sort of density for those cards to work. But a lot of them are totally self-contained, and they're just using oil counters as a way to sort of track some state, like Mind Slice Apparatus, which is an artifact with flash. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put counters on it, and then it gives you a discount on your instant sorceries, which is, nothing else has to care about oil counters for that to function. It's just a way to track the state, but it does give you this cool little mini game of how long can you wait and get your spells cheaper, and it's cool the way it interacts with Proliferate as well. So I agree that there's a lot of little mini games and cool story moments throughout all these counters, and from charge counters to oil counters, we get a lot of that coming through in a cool way.
Let's hit some of the major cycles in the set. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah, I do think that there are a bunch of other named themes, or a bunch of other unnamed themes that come through. So one of the other big things that I noticed, and we've seen this in the last couple sets, is artifacts. There are 60 cards that reference artifacts in some way. Obviously, we saw that with the Mirrodin cards, the equipments. Also, it just flavorfully makes a lot of sense that the
a lot of
Phyrexians
artifacts.
are
It's definitely
a
an
bunch of
artifact
machines.
set for sure.
So if you are building a cube that has a big artifact theme in it, you want more things that either are just sort of incidental artifacts or care about artifacts, there is a ton for you to dig into here.
Yeah, and a good example is we got Skrelv in this set, which is kind of just the artifact variation of a Mother of Runes, Giver of Runes style card with different limitations on it, but it's an artifact that does that sort of similar thing. So if you have that spot you're trying to fill in your cube and it would be beneficial for you to have an artifact there for whatever reason, then this set gives you options there. And it does that across a lot of different spots on the curve.
Yeah, and I think specifically one of the things that there's doing a lot of in the set is white aggressive cards that care about artifacts. So I know that's a little bit of a theme supported by a lot of those original Mirrodin cards that a lot of cube designers include in their cubes, and this is just going to be a lot more fodder to build up those kinds of themes. Another unnamed thing we have is Mite Tokens, this new token type, little creatures that have toxic, and a ton of cards just make these incidental little mites. These remind me, they also can't block, which is important, remind me a lot of Disturbed. I don't think it's a boo. I think that it is probably a good design decision.
I mean, we talked about this with Decayed Zombies. Like, yes, it gives them additional knobs to turn to, like, balance cards and whatnot, but I just don't want to play creatures that can't block in my cube. It's so boring.
I don't know if that's true, because when you actually sit down to play the games, it actually forces you to make different decisions you might not otherwise, because
it forces you to make one decision, which is attack. That's all it can do.
Exactly.
It limits decisions. It literally limits decisions. Don't pretend like it doesn't limit decisions.
I think it lets them design cards that wouldn't otherwise be designed that make a lot more Mite Tokens, because otherwise the boards would just get gummed up and everybody would be able to block all the time. And now you actually think about, well, am I okay just attacking with a bunch of mites and getting my death triggers on whatever it cares about when it sees artifacts dying, stuff like that. And I think that gameplay is good.
I didn't end up liking a single Decayed card, so maybe I'll be proven wrong by these Mite cards, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's like you play it and you're like, oh, wait, this is like, it's like less than half a creature a lot of the time. Unless you are literally the aggressor, which, you know, you can't always rely on all the time. The creature's just not, it's not good. I don't like it. Boo.
I think you're wrong. I just think they're neat.
I'm glad you think the mites are neat.
The last big theme I saw is there's a lot of non-creature matters cards, which we've seen again and again, especially in blue-red. There are a lot of cards that are going to care about casting spells, but there are a bunch of new ones here that will both care about artifacts as well as instant sorceries. So, again, if you have a spells matter or artifacts matter theme in your cube, or just that's the kind of gameplay that you enjoy, you like doing the spell slinging thing, this set is going to offer a lot for you.
On to some cycles then, maybe?
Let's talk about some cycles.
So there's a couple of things that jump out at me here. The first cycle that jumps out at me is the Dominus Cycle. There is a fairly large legendary creature in each color that is a Dominus, and what they share mechanically is some sort of activated ability with Phyrexian mana in it and some other cost that lets you put an indestructible counter on them. Importantly, for all of them, you can activate this ability at instant speed, and I think for most of them, what you're going to want to do is basically threaten that activation as opposed to activating it a bunch of times. So you're going to want to basically have this card that your opponents never want to point a removal spell at, never want to block, and offer a trade with their big creature because you'll be able to make it indestructible and save it. Small time traveling note here. My first read of this mechanic was that the indestructible counter had to be removed to grant indestructible to end of turn, but no. Once you put a counter on them, they're indestructible forever, so threat of activation may be not as scary as actual activation, and you only ever have to do it once. I think the way these will kind of affect the texture of games is going to be pretty similar to like the gods from Amonkhet or Hour of Devastation. Were there gods in both? Yeah, I think there were gods in both. The cards that keep coming back. These are all, 4, 5, 6 mana cards. They're big, beefy threats that just kind of like threaten to stick around and end games. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's definitely an option for you in that cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting they did bring back Phyrexian mana, but just in the activated abilities of these cards, which...
Just where it's safe.
It's obviously
it's in the casting cost of the completed Planeswalkers, too.
True, yeah, but those always have some accompanied colored mana as well that you can't just pay life for.
There is no card that has been turned from a colored card to a colorless card by the presence of Phyrexian mana in this
Which,
set.
Again, going back to this just being like the fixed version, this is just a much safer way for them to use Phyrexian mana because you already had those colors, you were good for it, but it is still very relevant that these are things you're going to want to do. You're going to probably want to do it instant speed, so maybe you don't want to keep up mana for. So I think it makes a lot of sense to see Phyrexian mana here.
The next cycle, also one in every color, is the Twilight Cycle. This is a callback to the Zenith Cycle.
Until you just said it, I didn't realize it, and then it's like, oh yeah, we had the Green Sun Zenith, now we have the Green Sun's Twilight.
Yep.
Which is kind of cool. We actually see the Sons of Mirrodin on the horizon adjacent to some big monument in all of these illustrations.
Yeah. So this is a callback to the Zenith Cycle, which were all sorceries or instants with X in their mana cost, and you could scale them up. And this is very similar. The only other thing that connects all of these is that all of the Twilight spells have an extra ability if you pay 5 or more into the X cost. So you have some effect. For example, the white one makes these Mite artifact creature tokens equal to whatever you pay for X. But if you pay 5 or more, you also get to destroy all other creatures, which is pretty good.
And then it doesn't matter that they can't block because you've destroyed all the other creatures.
Yeah, so why not make them be able to block then? Huh? Why not, Anthony? That's right. So whether a cube will like these cards or not, obviously is going to come down to what they each individually do, But I do think this little bone they throw you if you dump a bunch of mana into this X spell is really nice. And it reminds me of the Ravenous keyword from the 40k sets, of which you only care about one card, and that card is Mawloc. That's the red-green fight creature with X in its mana cost that enters the battlefield with some +1/+1 counters. But if you pay 5 or more for Ravenous, it's also 5 for Ravenous, interestingly. So another mechanic that is basically identical to another one. This is actually keyworded here, so it's not the same. Either way, the fact that if you dump 7 mana into your X spell creature, you get a little bit back. In the case of Ravenous, you draw a card. In the case of these, the spells get a lot better. So they reward you if you go really big on your X cost, which is overall, I think, a trait I like in X spells. A lot of times, I think X spells kind of have a curve where they max out their value, where it's best if you're casting it for X's 3 or 4 or something, and then anything beyond that, you're just kind of risking getting blown out. And here, giving you a little reward on the end there, if you do get to 5 or more, I think is nice mechanically.
Yeah, I think in particular, the modality on the ones that actually change the effect very drastically, the blue one just gives you double the effect, which is cool, great. You're going to want to be able to do that, but the white one turning just into a totally different spell and doing something different, I really like that idea of, shaping your spells based on what the game is, and using the cost rather than just literally bullet points is a cool way to do that.
The next cycle I was really excited to see here is the Cycle of Spheres. There is a new land, 1 in each color at common, that enters the battlefield taps for the colored mana of its respective color, and then also has an activated ability for 1 and that color, so 1 and a white or whatever. You can sacrifice it to draw a card, which is a really interesting take on the sort of Horizon Canopy style card, or even the Cycling Land style card. This is one of the ones you can, again, cycle from play instead of cycle from hand. In this case, you're paying the cost of coming into play tapped as opposed to taking damage off of one of the Horizon cards, but a really interesting cycle, I think some cubes will really be interested in.
Yeah, I really like these cards individually, and I think that my first comparison was the Cycling Lands, and I think that in a lot of environments, these actually will play better than the Cycling Lands. Obviously, the Cycling Lands, you draw them late, you get to throw it away when you have plenty of lands. These, I think the play pattern might be even better because you can just play them early in the game, play it whenever you...
You want to play your tap land on turn 1. Pretty much all the time.
Turn 1 or whenever it fits into your curve if you're drawing it somewhere in the mid-game. But then being able to cash those in later is just a pretty powerful effect. Obviously, in a lot of the really high-powered cubes, I don't think these are going to be super relevant. But if you're anywhere doing something that's a little bit more lower power, a little more tailored, these are just going to be pretty cool lands.
Then we briefly mentioned the cycle of completed Planeswalkers. There are a lot of Planeswalkers in this set. I guess there are 10, right? There's 10 because there's 10 Planeswalkers that said we're going to be in the set, which is more than your average set. Usually we get 3 or 4 or something.
Yeah, usually we only have a couple in there at Mythic, but I think half of them are at Rare this time.
Half are at Rare, half are at Mythic, and half of them are completed. And the completed Planeswalkers, they all have color requirements in their mana costs. So like you said, the Phyrexian mana, which is present in their casting costs here, is not going to allow you to remove a color requirement from a card. But it does allow you basically these modal Planeswalkers you can play on 2 or more different parts of the curve. The Nissa, for example, I think has 2 Phyrexian mana symbols. So there's 3 different places on the curve you can play Nissa. And the completed ability basically says that for each Phyrexian mana that you paid life for instead of mana, the Planeswalker enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. So again, just kind of a scalable way to allow you to cast a Planeswalker as a 4-drop or a 5-drop and have it be 2 loyalty better if you cast it as a 5-drop. And that kind of goes across the entire cycle there. Do we need more modality on Planeswalkers? Have they not modal enough already?
That's a really good point. I don't know. I historically don't play with a ton of Planeswalkers. They don't feature prominently in most of the cubes that I've designed, and I don't feel confident in my evaluation of these Planeswalkers. I'm sure that some of these are going to be fun and relevant, but not to me, probably.
Not to me. I think it's cool to have more modality there. I love modal cards.
Okay, so yes is what you're looking for.
Even though it's more complexity. I think the trade-off here is that a lot of these Planeswalkers, I think, are mechanically a little simpler because they have that block of completed text on them. There's a little less space for additional abilities. But yeah, a whole cycle of modal Planeswalkers if you're interested in that sort of thing. I think the last cycle I have flagged here, I'm sure there's some things I missed, but maybe you know of one I missed, is the Skullbomb Cycle, which is a direct callback to the Spell Bombs, a very popular cycle from original Mirrodin block. These are all little dinky artifacts that you can either, in Spellbomb Spirit, sacrifice to draw a card, and importantly, the sacrificing to draw a card, they're all 1 to play, they're all 1 to sack and draw a card, and there's no color requirements there. And then each spell bomb has an activated ability on color to do some effect, and also draw a card. And this is where it differs slightly from the spell bombs. The way the spell bombs work is you could either draw a card for colorless mana, or for colored mana you could get some other effect. Bounce a creature, whatever. Here, the activated abilities are more expensive, but you draw a card either way. If you're sacrificing this thing to either ability, you're always going to get your card back.
I mean, you know that I'm going to be a fan of this cycle. Big, complicated planeswalkers, not so much.
This is my favorite cycle by far.
Little dinky artifacts that draw you cards, excellent. I'm all in.
Well, we're going to talk about this in next week's episode, because I think you said there's only one card from this set you're interested in playing, and I have here, I'm starting a new tradition where I bully you with, I have 9 cards from this cube.
For the regular cube?
Yeah.
This is great. You're doing my homework for me?
I have 9 cards that I'm like, these all seem like they could fit. Well, one of them is a little optimistic, but the other ones that feel like they're almost slam dunks in your cube. So I'll be excited to hear why they aren't fits for you if that is in fact the case in our next episode. That's what they call a teaser in the business, Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, I just love these because they have a lot of opportunity to interact with a lot of effects if you care about drawing more than one card a turn, if you care about artifacts, if you care about death triggers, things like that, when artifacts go to the graveyard. There's just a lot there to work on cards that are really easy to put in a lot of your decks. You can even put them sort of like off-color spell bombs if you have a little bit of a light splash. These really, I didn't put any of these on my list.
I love them for the light splashing reason.
I think that, yeah, maybe some of these should be reconsidered for the regular cube.
Did we miss any clear cycles or other sort of trends in the set, Anthony?
I'm certain we did. I mean, we didn't talk about
I guess the other tiny little things. There's a lot of goblins floating around, so if you're doing goblin tribal stuff, you get another couple cards for that sort of thing. We have the reprint of Phyrexian Obliterator, and then the white sort of alternative to that, which, by the way, I think is really bad, personally. I wouldn't touch that card with a 10-foot pole. That's not really a theme. That's just one individual card. So a little bit of a shorter episode today, which actually is okay because I have to edit a bunch of these before we go to MagicCon Philadelphia, where we'll be doing a panel. Our panel is going to be 1:30 p.m. on Saturday. There's only one stage, so that's the stage we'll be on. And if you're going to be at MagicCon Philadelphia, please show up and, I don't know, cheer loudly, turn to the stranger next to you and say, wow, these guys seem so smart. You know, something like that would be very helpful. But yeah, just show up. We want to see people out there.
Leave us a 5-star review with the person standing next to you.
Also looking forward to meeting a bunch of people at MagicCon Philly. For those of you that couldn't make it out to CubeCon, because you're East Coast based, we're going to be there. And we're going to be playing a lot of Cube. We're doing a roto draft of the regular Cube leading up to the event, and then we're going to be handing out the decks to all of our friends from different cities that are all at the event, and then playing the matches throughout the event as we run into each other. I'm having a ton of fun doing this roto draft. I mean, I haven't roto drafted except for we did the one in person of my Cube back in December, but prior to that, we hadn't roto drafted in a while just because it is really involved. We've been playing Cube every week otherwise, but big shout out again to rotisserie drafting. It's just, I feel like I understand why people love fantasy sports when we roto draft, because it's just an excuse to be in a chat room where you're trash talking with your friends about a thing you love 24/7, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the best part of it is, yeah, trash talking against people. And yeah, we're doing my regular cube, which is really exciting. We have some very talented players evaluating this for the first time and seeing their perspective on this cube that I've spent a lot of time curating is a lot of fun. And I think it is a really fun cube to roto draft as well, because there are, with all these little overlapping synergies, a lot of ways that players can try and, you know, snake people and get the right hate pick and balance. Are they taking stuff for their deck, or are they hating it from somebody else? It's just a lot going on.
Of course you think it's a fun cube to roto draft. It's your cube.
I know, yeah. I put all the best cards in it.
I think it's really fun to roto draft too. I really like my deck. I think I drafted very well. You know, I think I'm a worse player than a lot of people we're playing against, so I'm going to have to hope my drafting kind of fills in the gaps there. I'm terrified of Parnell's deck.
It's so scary.
I think Parnell is a good candidate for like an actual, we're doing a 10-player roto. I think it's a good candidate for an actual 9-0. I think his deck
would not be surprised.
Really disgusting.
And he did it so casually and confidently too. He's just planted his flag and just...
Yeah, two gold cards essentially in pick 1 and pick 2, and I think we're all doomed. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah,
I don't know how I could make myself not doomed against him. I'm looking at all the cards I could pick later on, and I'm like, nope, no matter what I take, I think I'm doomed.
Yep, I'm just going to play a Maze Mind Tome and be like, I'm going to draw some cards while you crush me. It's going to be great.
One other small announcement. So a internet acquaintance of ours, Fandwick or Civ Dude, depending on what Cube worlds you're in. There's a Cube subreddit, Cube Discords. He is organizing a little California Cube convention, a little mini CubeCon of sorts. It's going to be in Santa Rosa in June. It's on June 10th and 11th. He mentioned that it's close by to an airport. It's only 20 minutes from an airport, and there's a bunch of hotels nearby. He's doing it in conjunction with a local game store owner he is friendly with. It's going to be a 2-day event, and it's limited to 64 players, so it is smaller than CubeCon, and once they hit 64 players, then they are capped out. $25 buy-in, and whatever doesn't go towards running the event direct cost is also going to go directly to prize support. So it seems like a great little event, especially if you're already on the West Coast, and maybe that trip to Wisconsin was a little too much for you to bite off. This seems like a really cool thing to do. There's no website for this, but there is a Discord, which you can find at bit.ly/CaliforniaCube. And there is also a Eventbrite page where you can actually buy tickets, and that's at bit.ly/CaliforniaCube tickets. So check the show notes for that if you're interested in showing up. Again, June 10th and 11th in Santa Rosa, California. If it doesn't sell out, we'll mention it again as the event gets closer.
It's so exciting to see more Cube stuff happening. I feel like this is really going to be a big year for Cube, and people actually just getting together and playing.
Yeah, and we don't take any kind of ads. We can't be bought. But if you do run a Cube event, we will definitely mention it on the show, as long as you don't seem like a creep. We did meet Civ Dude / Fandwick in person at CubeCon, and he at least didn't steal our organs then. So at least one little vote to not stealing your organs this time either.
Great, just putting that fear into people.
And with that, that is the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks for doing that with me, Anthony.
Hey, thanks for you doing it with me. Great job.
Beep boop.
Guy.
I mean, he's got the flared base, but he's kind of lacking the little indentation to keep it from popping out, you know?